The Trans-Saharan slave trade, a dark and often overlooked chapter in history, had profound and far-reaching impacts, spanning from the 7th century until the early 20th century. This trade was marked by immense suffering and a deeply entrenched system of human exploitation. The origins of the Trans-Saharan slave trade can be traced back to the rise of the Islamic caliphates. As Islam spread across North Africa and into West Africa, the demand for slaves increased. The trade was fueled by the need for labor, military service, and domestic servants in expanding Islamic territories. Slaves were captured primarily through raids, wars, and the exploitation of existing rivalries between African tribes and kingdoms. The journey for enslaved Africans began with their capture, often during violent raids that tore apart communities. Captives were bound and forced to march 4 weeks or months to reach the major slave trading centers at the edge of the Sahara. This initial phase was brutal, with many perishing due to starvation, disease, or the violence inflicted by their captors. Once at the trading centers, the real ordeal began. Slaves were sold to traders who organized caravans to transport them across the Sahara Desert. This journey, covering thousands of miles of harsh desert terrain, was one of unimaginable hardship. Enslaved individuals were often shackled and forced to march in extreme heat, with little food or water. The mortality rate was high, with some estimates suggesting that up to 20% of the captives died en route due to dehydration, exhaustion, and abuse. The caravans, led by experienced traders, navigated through perilous conditions. The Sahara Desert, known for its vast expanses of sand and severe climate, was a formidable barrier. Temperatures could soar to unbearable levels during the day and drop sharply at night. Sandstorms were a constant threat, capable of disorienting caravans and burying those who could not keep pace. The physical and psychological toll on the enslaved was immense, with many losing hope and succumbing to despair. Upon reaching the northern edges of the Sahara, survivors were taken to major slave markets in cities such as Timbuktu, Gao, Cairo, and Tripoli. These markets were bustling hubs of commerce, where slaves were inspected, auctioned, and sold to the highest bidder. Buyers included wealthy merchants, landowners, and officials who required labor for their estates, mines, and households. The lives of slaves in the Islamic world varied widely depending on their roles and the disposition of their owners. Some slaves worked in harsh conditions on plantations or in quarries, performing back-breaking labor from dawn to dusk. Others served in domestic settings, often facing physical and sexual abuse. Female slaves, in particular, were vulnerable to being forced into concubinage, where they were subjected to sexual exploitation and used to produce offspring for their masters. A distinct group of slaves were those trained as soldiers, known as Mamluks. These slave soldiers, recruited from various ethnic backgrounds, including Africans, Slavs, and Circassians, were trained in military arts and often rose to significant positions of power. The Mamluks of Egypt, originally slave soldiers, eventually established their own dynasty and ruled for several centuries, illustrating the complex dynamics of slavery in the Islamic world. Despite Islamic teachings that advocated for the humane treatment of slaves and encouraged manumission, the reality was often grim. Slaves were considered property, and their treatment depended largely on the whims of their owners. While some slaves were able to gain their freedom through loyal service or by converting to Islam, many lived their entire lives in bondage, subjected to relentless exploitation and cruelty. The impact of the Trans-Saharan slave trade on African societies was profound. The constant threat of raids and enslavement created a climate of fear and instability. Entire communities were depopulated as able-bodied men, women, and children were captured and sold into slavery. The social fabric of African societies was torn apart, with traditional structures and systems of governance disrupted. The loss of population and the ongoing violence hindered economic development and contributed to the weakening of states and empires. Moreover, The trade had lasting cultural and demographic effects. The intermingling of African, Arab, and Berber cultures led to the emergence of new ethnic groups and cultural practices in the regions involved. However, it also left a legacy of racial discrimination and social stratification that persists in some areas to this day. The end of the Trans-Saharan slave trade was a gradual process, influenced by various factors, including the decline of the Islamic empires, the abolitionist movements in Europe and America, and the colonization of Africa by European powers. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, international pressure and changing economic conditions led to the decline of the slave trade, although pockets of slavery persisted into the 20th century. Reflecting on the Trans-Saharan slave trade is crucial for understanding the full scope of human history and the pervasive nature of slavery across different cultures and eras. It serves as a sobering reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty and exploitation, and underscores the importance of continuing to fight against modern forms of slavery and human trafficking. In remembering the millions of lives affected by the Trans-Saharan slave trade, we honor their suffering and resilience. It is through this acknowledgement that we can work towards a future where the horrors of slavery are never repeated, and where all people are free to live with dignity and respect.